Alright guys, so today we're going to be talking about rationalizing the denominator, which kind of takes what we've already learned and just adds one more step to it. This can be the trickiest kind of simplifying radicals, so make sure that you take your time, don't rush, and make sure you really do understand the different things that I'm doing here, okay? So the first thing is important to know is that you're not allowed to have radicals in the denominator of any fractions. If that happens, that means that you're not fully simplified and you have to keep going. And the way that you get rid of the radical in the denominator is to multiply both the numerator and the denominator by that radical that's in the bottom and then simplify both radicals. Now, what I like to do before that happens is I like to simplify the fractions as much as possible, given that they are allowed to be simplified. The only way they're allowed to be simplified is if both numbers are either under a radical or both numbers are not under a radical. So keep that in mind. So let's take a look at the first one. I have radical 10 over radical 3. Both are under a radical. However, 10/3 does not simplify, so I'm not able to simplify that before getting rid of the radical in the denominator. 10 and 3 both do not simplify by themselves, so I'm just going to go straight into multiplying by the square root of 3 on the top and the square root of 3 on the bottom. Now, both of these are under radicals, so I can actually multiply them. 10 times 3 is 30, so I have radical 30. 3 times 3 is 9, so I get radical 9. Now my next step would be to try and simplify the square root of 30. So again, I do the same thing I've been doing. Cut that in half, that's 15, so that means I would start right here at 9. 9 and 4 are the only options that I could use to simplify 30, but neither one of them go into 30, so I would keep that square root of 30 the same. However, 9 is a perfect square. Square root of 9 is 3, and now suddenly there's no radical in the bottom. I can't simplify 30 over 3, though, because the 30 is under a radical and the 3 is not. So that would be my final answer right there. Okay? All right, looking at the second one, both numbers are under a radical. So the first thing I'm going to do is look and see if I can simplify it. 2/6 does simplify to 1/3, so I can simplify this to radical 1 over radical 3. And the square root of 1 is just 1. So now I have 1 over radical 3. The problem is I can't have that radical in the bottom. There's no perfect square that goes into it, so I'm going to multiply the top by radical 3 and the bottom by radical 3. Anything times 1 is still itself, even though that 1's not under a radical, so I get radical 3. Radical 3 times radical 3 is radical 9. Again, there's no perfect square that goes into 3, so that's going to stay the same. However, the square root of 9 is 3, so now I have the square root of 3 over 3, and that is my final answer. Okay? For the next one here, the 4 is not underneath a radical, so I can't simplify the 4 over 6. There's no perfect square that goes into 6, so in order to get rid of it, I'm going to multiply the top by radical 6 and the bottom by radical 6. Again, the 4 doesn't have a radical, so I can't multiply the 4 and the 6 together, so it's just going to stay 4 radical 6 on the top. Radical 6 times radical 6 is radical 36. All right, again, there's no perfect square that goes into this radical 6 here. So 4 radical 6 stays the same. And then the square root of 36 is just 6. Now we have one step left. The 4 and the 6 here are both outside of a radical, so I can simplify that. 4 over 6 is 2/3, so I'm going to end up with 2 radical 6 on top over 3 on the bottom. And that would be my final answer. Okay? All right, next one. Both numbers are under a radical, but 12 over 5 does not simplify. 12, though, has a perfect square that goes into it, and it's 4. So I'm going to simplify that first. Radical 4 times radical 3 is the same as radical 12. 5 doesn't simplify, though, so I'm going to leave that alone. The square root of 4 is 2, so now I have 2 radical 3 over radical 5. 3/5 does not simplify, so I can't change that. I have to get rid of the radical down here, so I'm going to multiply the top and the bottom by radical 5. That's going to give me 2. Radical 3 times radical 5 can be multiplied to give you radical 15. Radical 5 times radical 5 is radical 25. All right, here again, the square root of 15 does not have a perfect square that goes into it, so it's going to stay 2 radical 15. Square root of 25 is 5. And then the last thing I have to check is to see if 2/5 simplifies, which it does not, so that's my final answer. All right, next one here. Radical 3 over radical 8. They're both radicals, but 3 over 8 doesn't simplify. However, 8 has a perfect square that goes into it. It's 4. So I'm going to leave radical 3 alone. Radical 8 becomes radical 4, radical 2. Square root of 4 is 2, so now I have radical 3 over 2, radical 2. 3 over 2 still does not simplify, so to get rid of this radical 2, I have to multiply the top and the bottom by radical 2. 3 times 2 is 6, so I have radical 6 on top, and then 2, and then radical 2 times radical 2 is radical 4. Now, a lot of times kids will see this and think, oh, the square root of 6 over the square root of 4 simplifies. However, don't do that because 4 is a perfect square. So it's much better to just go ahead and take that out. The square root of 4 is 2, but you got to remember this is being multiplied here. So now I have radical 6 over 2 times 2, which is 4. So I have radical 6 over 4. And there is no perfect square that goes into radical 6. They're not both under a radical, so I can't simplify, so I'm finished. All right, next one, radical 11 over radical 27. Again, 11 over 27 does not simplify. However, there's a perfect square that goes into radical 27. It happens to be 9. So radical 11 stays the same. And then I have radical 9 times radical 3. Square root of 9 is 3. So now I have radical 11 over 3 radical 3. Again, 11 over 3 doesn't simplify, so I got to get rid of that radical 3 down here by multiplying the top and the bottom by radical 3. 11 times 3 is 33, so I get radical 33 on top. I have that 3 out in front, and then radical 3 times radical 3 is radical 9. Last step, square root of 9 is 3, so I have radical 33 on top over 3 times 3 on the bottom. And 3 times 3 is 9. So now I have radical 33 over 9 as my final answer. I can't simplify anymore. All right, we got a couple more left, or well, 3 left here. So let me just move this camera so you can see what I'm about to do. All right, 3 more, and then I have some for you to try. All right, we have the square root of 20 over the square root of 3, which does not simplify. However, 20 does have a perfect square that goes into it. It's 4. So I have the square root of 4 times the square root of 5, because 4 times 5 is 20, over the square root of, 4 square root of 3. Square root of 4 is 2. So that gives me 2 radical 5 over 4 radical 3. And once again, this 2/4 can be simplified to 1/2. So now I have 1 radical 5, or just radical 5, over 2 radical 3. 5/3 does not simplify, though. I got to get rid of this radical 3, and I do that by multiplying the top and the bottom by radical 3. 5 times 3 is 15, so radical 15 over 2 radical 3 times 3 is 9. But the square root of 9 is 3, so now I have radical 15 over 2 times 3, and then 2 times 3 is 6, so radical 15 over 6. There's no perfect square that goes into 15, so I am finished. All right, here we go. 32 over 4 does simplify. 32 divided by 4 is 8. So I'm going to get an 8 on the top, and all that's left on the bottom is a radical 2. I can't simplify that. They're not both under a radical, so I'm going to multiply the top and the bottom by radical 2. So I'm going to get 8 radical 2 over radical 4. And the square root of 4 is just 2, so now I have 8 radical 2 over 2. And once again, you got to simplify the 8 over 2, which is 4. So I get 4 radical 2. So this whole crazy thing up here simplifies to just 4 radical 2. All right, one more. Radical 27 over radical 3 simplifies. 27 divided by 3 is just 9. So now I have the square root of 9 over that 12 that's down there. And the square root of 9 is a perfect square, guys. The square root of 9 is 3, so I get 3 over 12, which simplifies to 1/4. And that's it. All right, ladies and gents, your job is to do the U-Try on pages 151 and 152, and then you have a homework assignment to do on Canvas. If you need any help, send me a message or attend office hours. All right, have a wonderful day, guys.